Welcome to the Shadows, where every tale is a darn good read. Dungeons and Dragons, A Turn of the Dice, a darn good read original. Dungeons and Dragons night was our ritual, a weekly sanctuary where the worries of the outside world couldn't reach us. Marcus, our dungeon master, presided over the table like a conductor over an orchestra. The scene was always the same. A sturdy oak table surrounded by 4 chairs, dim candlelight flickering against the walls, and the low hum of anticipation as we prepared for another adventure. Snacks littered the table. Marcus insisted on balance, with chips and soda alongside pretzels and fruit. But dice were the centerpiece. That night, I arrived first, as usual. Marcus greeted me with a nod, his hands busy shuffling through stacks of notes. He always prepped down to the finest detail, hand-drawn maps, intricately written NPC backstories, everything a campaign could need. Sarah was next, sliding into her usual spot with her notebook and dice box. She was the strategist of our group, and her character sheets were meticulously organized, as always. Jason showed up last, barreling through the door with his usual grin, a backpack slung over his shoulder. He was the wild card of the group, always unpredictable, but always bringing energy to the table. That night, though, he had something new. "I found something perfect for tonight," he said, his voice filled with excitement. He tossed his bag onto the floor and pulled out a small, cracked leather pouch. The pouch itself looked old, its edges frayed and its surface worn smooth in places. It looked out of place next to Jason's usual haphazard collection of snacks and gear. He tipped it over, and dice spilled onto the table. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, but as they settled, something about them felt off. Their surfaces weren't smooth like plastic dice. They were uneven, almost textured, dark and mottled. The material absorbed the flickering candlelight instead of reflecting it. The numbers carved into them were deep, almost gouged, and the edges of the dice seemed to shift ever so slightly in the light. "Found these at a pawn shop," Jason said, grinning. "The guy there said they were vintage or something. Thought they'd add some atmosphere." Sarah reached out, hesitating slightly before running her finger over one of the dice. She pulled back immediately, her brow furrowed. "They feel weird, like leather." Jason shrugged, clearly unfazed. "Makes them cooler, right? Don't overthink it. They're just dice." Marcus gave the dice a brief glance, but didn't comment. "Let's get started. We've got a temple to explore, and I have a feeling you'll want all the time you can get." The session began like any other. Our party ventured into the depths of a ruined temple, battling skeletons and deciphering ancient traps. Jason's dice rolled as they should, though they made an odd sound against the table. Softer, heavier, like something damp hitting wood. Every now and then, I caught myself glancing at them, drawn in by their strange, almost organic appearance. But the game demanded focus, and I pushed the unease aside. It wasn't until an hour in that things started to feel wrong. Sarah paused mid-turn, her pencil hovering above her character sheet. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Marcus looked up from his notes. "Hear what?" Sarah glanced under the table, her expression uneasy. "Scratching, like claws on wood." Jason laughed, a little too loudly. "Probably the wind, or a mouse. Marcus, your house isn't haunted, is it?" Marcus frowned, but didn't reply. We all sat still for a moment, listening. At first there was nothing, just the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. But then I heard it, faint and irregular, like something moving just out of sight. It was soft at first, almost easy to dismiss, but it grew louder, sharper, until it seemed to come from directly beneath us. Sarah leaned back, pulling her feet up onto her chair. "That's not the wind," she said softly. "Let's keep going," Marcus said, though his voice carried an edge of discomfort. "We're wasting time." We tried to press on, but the sound didn't stop. It grew more frequent, more insistent, until it felt like the air in the room was changing, thickening. My focus drifted from the game to Jason's dice, which seemed darker now, their uneven surfaces glistening faintly in the candlelight. Then it happened. Jason rolled his D20, and it bounced off the table. He leaned down to retrieve it, and the moment his hand reached out, he yelped and pulled it back. Blood welled from a thin cut on his palm. "Did you?" Sarah started, but Jason cut her off. "It bit me," he said, his voice low and trembling. "The die. It bit me." The room went deathly silent. I stared at the die on the floor. It looked the same as before, unmoving, inert. But something was wrong, profoundly, disturbingly wrong. Jason reached for it again, slower this time, and as his fingers brushed its surface, the die twitched. It wasn't a random wobble. It moved with intent. Its leathery exterior rippled, and then it split open. What emerged was something I can only describe as alive. Thin, sinewy limbs unfolded from its surface, glistening and wet. A circular maw opened where the numbers had been, lined with needle-like teeth that glinted in the candlelight. It hissed, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. And then it lunged. Jason screamed as the creature latched onto his arm, its teeth sinking deep into his flesh. Blood ran down his wrist, pooling on the table as he tried to shake it off. I scrambled backward, my chair toppling over, as the rest of Jason's dice began to move. The D4 scuttled across the table like a spiny crab, its edges jagged and sharp. The D12 sprouted tendrils, writhing and lashing out at anything within reach. One by one, they transformed, their leathery shells tearing apart to reveal grotesque, writhing forms. Marcus grabbed his notes and swung them like a club, smashing one of the creatures into the table. Sarah backed toward the door, her eyes wide with terror. Jason, pale and shaking, managed to fling the creature off his arm, but not before it left deep, bloody gouges behind. "Get out!" Marcus shouted. "Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing Jason by the arm, I dragged him toward the door. The sound of skittering claws and wet, tearing movements filling the room behind us. We burst into the cold night air, slamming the door shut behind us. Jason collapsed onto the porch, clutching his bleeding arm. None of us spoke for a long moment. The reality of what had just happened, too impossible to process. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "What the hell were those things?" Jason stared at his arm, his face pale. His voice was barely a whisper. "I thought they were just dice." You've escaped the story, but the abyss waits patiently. it will always pull you back for a darn good read. Like and subscribe for more.